It is still the deadliest earthquake the world has ever recorded. In a single winter night, 830,000 people vanished, not because the earth shook harder than anywhere else, but because of where they were sleeping. They had carved their homes into the cliffs, and in the dark, the cliffs came down on top of them. This is the story of the night the mountains moved, and the deadliest earthquake in human history. In the 16th century, the heartland of China lay along the Wei River in the province of Shaanxi. It was the reign of the Jiajing Emperor in the long afternoon of the Ming dynasty. For more than 2,000 years, this valley had been a cradle of Chinese civilization. Nearby stood Xi'an, once Chang'an, the ancient imperial capital where the Silk Road began. By 1556, it was a crowded, prosperous heartland, home to millions of farmers and townsfolk. Along the way, the year turned on the rhythm of the fields, millet and wheat, oxen and plough, generation after generation. Caravans still threaded the old Silk Road through Shaanxi, carrying silk and porcelain toward distant western deserts. Market towns clustered along the river, their tiled roofs and earthen walls catching the morning sun. Here the land itself was unusual, a vast plateau of loess. Fine yellow soil heaped hundreds of feet deep. Over tens of thousands of years, dust storms from the northern deserts had buried this land hundreds of feet deep in fine silt. Rain and rivers had carved that silt into a maze of ravines, ridges, and sheer earthen walls. Wind had carried that dust across the centuries until it stood in great golden cliffs above the rivers. Loess is strange earth, soft enough to dig with bare hands, yet able to stand in sheer vertical walls. Dry, it holds firm for centuries, but it carries a hidden weakness, and the people had learned to live inside it. They carved their homes directly into the soft cliff faces, rooms, hearths, whole villages hollowed out of the earth. These cave homes were called yaodong, and millions of people slept in them every night. They were warm in winter, cool in summer, cheap to build, a gift from the land. For 1,000 years, the loess had sheltered them. Each autumn, the harvest filled the granaries. Each winter, the families withdrew into the warm earth to wait out the cold. No one understood that the same soft earth that kept them warm could come down like water. On the night of the 23rd of January 1556, the valley settled into a deep winter cold. Lanterns went dark one by one across the cliff villages. Frost gathered on the terraces. The rivers ran black and slow beneath the moon. Inside the cliffs, hundreds of thousands of families slept behind walls of packed earth. Children slept against their parents on the warm brick beds. The old lay nearest the dying embers. Outside, the dogs fell silent and the night birds stopped their calling. It was, by every account, an ordinary night. And then, just past midnight, the ground began to move. At first, it was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling up from beneath the floor. Then the earth heaved, and the lamps spilled, and the vaulted ceilings began to rain down. Deep beneath the Wei River, a fault that had been locked for centuries finally tore loose. The shock raced upward through hundreds of feet of loose yellow soil. And loess does not behave like stone. Shaken hard enough, it flows. Across the valley, the great cliffs trembled, and then began to shear away. Whole hillsides slumped and collapsed, folding the cave homes shut in an instant. The roar rose until it drowned every other sound, the groan of the earth tearing itself apart. In seconds, villages that had stood for centuries were simply gone. Families were buried where they lay, behind walls of earth they had carved themselves. Above ground, the survivors stumbled into a world that had stopped making sense. Chroniclers wrote that mountains and rivers changed places. In some places, the ground rose up and formed new hills. In others, it dropped away into sudden valleys. Crevices opened in the earth, some more than 60 feet deep. The shaking went on far longer than any living person had ever felt. Temple bells rang on their own, and ponds threw their water onto the banks. Streams burst straight out of the ground, and fountains of sand and water shot into the freezing air. Where the soil had liquefied, solid ground became a churning trap that swallowed whatever stood on it. City walls, temples, official halls, and homes collapsed all at once. Roads split and buckled, stone bridges dropped into the rivers they had crossed. In the city of Huaxian, at the center of it all, more than half the people died that night. Huainan and Huayin fared no better. The shaking was felt across 500 miles, in province after province. From the deserts of the northwest to the Great Plains of the east, the land of 10 provinces trembled at once. When the first shock passed, the night was far from over. Lamps and cooking fires, knocked loose in the dark, set the wreckage alight. Landslides dammed the rivers, floods rose where villages had stood. Those trapped in the collapsed loess called out into the cold, and many were never reached. Rescue parties dug through the night, but for every person they freed, 100 more lay silent. There were too few hands and far too much earth. Dawn came grey and silent over a valley that no longer matched any map. Survivors crawled from the rubble into a freezing dawn, with no walls left to shelter them. They lit fires against the cold and the dark and waited for help that was slow to come. And the earth would not be still. Aftershocks struck several times a month for half a year. Each one brought down more weakened cliffs onto those still digging through them. Winter deepened, shelter was gone, grain stores lay buried, famine came first, and then plague followed the famine. Across 97 counties, the dying went on long after the ground grew quiet. Word of the disaster traveled slowly along the broken roads toward the capital. When it reached the Ming court, the sheer scale of the loss was almost impossible to grasp. When the imperial officials finally counted, the number was almost beyond belief. The census recorded a loss of 830,000 people. It remains, to this day, the deadliest earthquake in recorded human history. The shock itself had lasted only moments. The dying would go on for years, but the magnitude alone could not explain a toll so vast. Stronger earthquakes have struck emptier lands and killed almost no one. What made this one the deadliest was not its power. It was the cliffs the people had carved their lives into. Among the survivors was a scholar named Chin Keda. He lived through the night, and he did something rare. He wrote down what he had learned. "Do not rush outside the moment the shaking begins," he warned. "Crouch low and wait for your chance. Even if the nest is broken," he wrote, "some of the eggs may yet survive." It is among the oldest earthquake survival advice ever written, and it was bought with 800,000 lives. The scars of that night did not all vanish. In nearby Xi'an, the small wild goose pagoda was shaken so hard it lost 3 of its tiers. In the forest of Steles, ancient stone tablets carved with the classics cracked and toppled. The loess plateau still stands, golden and quiet, above the Wei River, and people still live in cave homes carved into its cliffs. But they build them differently now, braced and reinforced, taught by a single catastrophic night. In the centuries since, geologists have walked these valleys, reading the scars the quake left in the earth. They traced the fault that slipped that night, still drawing a faint line across the land. And they confirmed what the survivors already knew, that the soft earth which sheltered millions had become their grave. Because the lesson of 1556 was never really about the strength of the earth. It was about how close we choose to live to its edge. 830,000 people slept in the safest homes they had ever known, and the land they trusted simply folded around them in the dark. It was never that the earth shook harder. It was where they were sleeping. That is why, 4.5 centuries later, no earthquake has ever taken more. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. These videos take real work to research and bring to life. If you'd like to see more, consider subscribing. This has been Cataclysm History, and I'll see you in the next one.